The ground shook beneath the feet of the survivors. The faint hum of emergency generators was the only sound echoing through the cavernous, underground city. As Evan Price crouched near the war-torn entrance of the bunker, his eyes scanned the horizon, an empty, desolate wasteland where once humanity had thrived. Above, the sky was dark, darker than it had ever been before. The stars, once a comforting guide, had been blotted out. Only one thing remained, the cold, calculating threat of the Galactic assassins. Evan, Lyra's voice was steady but strained. They're closer than we thought. Evan's jaw tightened. His fingers brushed the hilt of the old rifle, the weight of it both familiar and foreign in his hands. His muscles tensed, not from fear, but from the anticipation of the battle to come. "How many?" he asked without turning around. "Too many," Lyra replied, her voice quiet now. "They've breached the outer perimeter. We don't have much time." Evan knew they didn't. The Galactic assassins had been hunting survivors across the galaxy for centuries, leaving destruction in their wake. Earth was no different. With every passing day, the assassins had drawn closer, their cold-blooded hunt bringing an end to humanity's final stronghold. Evan turned to face Lyra, his gaze briefly softening. She was a small woman, yet in the face of unspeakable odds, she had become a pillar of strength. Her long, dark hair was tied back in a simple knot, and the hardened lines around her eyes spoke of a life spent fighting for survival. Lyra wasn't just a medic, she was the heart of their small group of survivors. She had saved them all countless times, but even her skills couldn't save them from what was coming. "We fight," Evan said, his voice gruff. "We fight, or we die trying." Lyra met his gaze, her brow furrowed with worry. "Evan, don't. We've done this dance before, Lyra," he interrupted, his tone sharper now. "And you know what they're capable of. We don't have the luxury of hesitation anymore." In the distance, the unmistakable hum of the assassin's ships grew louder. Their presence was like a shadow, always just out of sight, but never far enough to forget. These were not mere invaders, they were predators, trained to hunt, to kill with precision and without mercy. Lyra swallowed hard but nodded. She trusted Evan more than she trusted herself. They had both been through too much to back down now. She turned and motioned for the others to prepare. Evan's hand lingered on the rifle. His mind was not only focused on the fight, but also on the faint whispers of a plan he'd been developing. They couldn't outgun the assassins, they were too advanced, too efficient. But Evan had learned long ago that survival wasn't just about brute strength. It was about strategy. It was about using what little they had left and turning it into an advantage. He turned back toward the survivors, his eyes scanning each face, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. There were only a dozen of them left, all scarred in one way or another, all hanging on by the thinnest thread of hope. Every day they lasted was a victory, but with the assassins closing in, that victory was slipping further from their grasp. "Listen up," Evan called out, his voice cutting through the tension. "We don't have much time. We're going to make our stand here. The plan is simple, hold them off long enough to get the signal out. We have to buy time for the others to escape." The survivors nodded, their expressions grim. They were tired, desperate, but there was no other option. They knew the stakes. "You're not thinking of facing them head-on, are you?" Lyra's voice cracked with disbelief. Evan's eyes hardened, his lips curling into a grim smile. "I don't have a choice." Lyra stepped closer, her face now inches from his. "Evan, don't do this. You've seen what they do. They won't show mercy. You can't fight them all." "I don't have to fight them all," Evan said softly, almost to himself. He glanced at the sky. "I just have to make them realize they're not the only hunters in this galaxy." As the hum of the ships grew louder, the survivors took their positions. The ground began to shake with the first steps of the approaching assassins. The time for escape was long gone. The time for survival had arrived, but survival, Evan knew, wasn't just about hiding. It was about becoming the predator. Evan took a deep breath and turned back to the group, his voice steady now, his decision made. "We're not hiding anymore. It's time to make them fear us. The words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise. Somewhere in the darkness, the Galactic assassins waited. But Evan knew one thing for certain: they would no longer be the apex predators. Not today. The distant hum of the assassins' ships was almost deafening, reverberating through the cracked walls of the underground city. Evan Price crouched behind a broken wall, his senses alert. He could feel the tremor in the air as the ships hovered overhead, casting their cold shadows over the barren wasteland. The final showdown was near, and he could taste the inevitability of it. Yet, deep within him, there was a flicker of something darker, something primal. Any sign of movement? Lyra's voice came through his earpiece, tight with anxiety. Evan's eyes flicked toward the horizon, where the silhouette of an assassin craft had just disappeared into the cloud-covered sky. Not yet, he replied, trying to steady his breath. But every fiber of his being was wound tight. He knew the battle was coming, it was only a matter of time. Lyra's next words were filled with an underlying dread. "We can't keep running, Evan. You know that. The weapon, you think it'll work?" His hand instinctively clenched around the ancient artifact he'd found beneath the city, a relic from an old war. It pulsed faintly, like a living thing. Its power had drawn him, almost as if it were calling out to him. The decision to use it, however, felt like a line that once crossed, could never be undone. "I don't know," he admitted. The silence between them was heavy. He'd seen the way Lyra looked at him when he'd made the decision to activate it. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew what this could mean for him. Evan glanced at the small group of survivors clustered in the shadows, more than a dozen people who had survived this long only through sheer willpower. The others were not warriors, but civilians, survivors of a world lost to war. They had trusted him to lead them, to keep them alive. And now, it was time to make that trust count. His heart raced. The weight of their expectations, of humanity's last hope, pressed down on him. He had trained his entire life for this, but he wasn't prepared for the gravity of what came next. "Evan," Lyra's voice was quieter now, filled with a softness he didn't expect. "The artifact, it's changing you. I can see it. Your eyes, they're different. You're not just fighting for survival anymore, are you?" Evan turned to face her, his expression hardening. "We're past survival. You saw the way they killed the others. We need to do more than hide. We need to make them fear us." The faintest flicker of hesitation passed through Lyra's gaze, but she nodded. "I know. Be careful. You're not the same person anymore." The air was growing colder, the anticipation thickening like the calm before a storm. Suddenly, the earth beneath them trembled as the distant hum grew louder. The assassins were coming. Evan's pulse quickened, and his grip on the weapon tightened. The time for preparation was over. "Positions," he barked, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension. The survivors sprang into action, moving quickly to their designated spots. A few of them were clearly inexperienced, their faces pale, but they followed his orders without question. They had no other choice. Evan took a deep breath, then motioned to Lyra. "We'll hold the line here. They'll want to push through the city, and that's where we'll make our stand." Lyra looked up at him, eyes searching, conflicted. "What if they overwhelm us?" "We'll do what we've always done, survive," Evan said, his voice steadier now. "Only we'll do it differently this time. We're not running anymore." The ground beneath them rumbled again, this time with more urgency. The first ship of the assassins' fleet appeared on the horizon, its sleek, dark form casting an ominous shadow over the crumbling city. Evan's breath hitched. The hunt had begun. Lyra reached out, touching his arm gently. "Are you ready?" Evan's jaw clenched. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the approaching ships. His body was tense, ready. His thoughts were already on the battlefield. He had no other choice now. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting to protect the last remnants of Earth's future. "I have to be," he said softly, but there was a conviction in his voice that sent a ripple through the survivors. The ship grew closer, its engines growling like a predator preparing to strike. Evan could feel the air shifting, charged with the threat of what was to come. And then, from the ship, a single figure descended. Tall, cloaked in dark armor, with eyes that gleamed like cold stars. It was Astra, the leader of the Galactic assassins. Her voice, amplified by a communicator, echoed across the battlefield. Evan Price. You've evaded us long enough. Surrender now, and we'll make your end swift. Evan's eyes locked onto hers. His hand trembled for a moment, not in fear, but in anticipation. I don't surrender, he said, his voice cutting through the silence. And just like that, the battle began. The sun had set long ago, and the night was alive with the hum of the assassin's fleet hovering overhead. Evan stood alone on the precipice of a ruined city, his breath shallow in the cold air. The survivors had scattered to their positions, waiting for his signal. But Evan was waiting for something else, the moment when he would push the button. The artifact, now humming steadily in his hands, pulsed with an unnatural energy, as if urging him to act. He could hear the distant footfalls of the assassin's ground forces. Astra was here. The leader of the invaders. Her presence loomed like a storm on the horizon. Evan had felt her eyes on him earlier, cold and calculating, assessing his every move. She was no ordinary foe. She knew how to hunt. She knew how to make people pay. The artifact vibrated in his grip, sending a shiver through him. Evan clenched his jaw. He had made the decision to use it, to wield the power that would change everything. But as he activated it, a part of him wondered if he was becoming something else, something darker than the man he had been. There was no turning back. Lyra appeared at his side, her face strained in the soft light of the artifact. Evan, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Are you sure about this? You've seen what it can do. What it's doing to you. Evan didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the distant glimmer of Astra's forces, preparing to descend on the city like locusts. I have to do this, Lyra. They'll never stop. They'll never rest until they've wiped us out completely. I know, she said, her voice faltering. But you're not just fighting them anymore, are you? You're fighting yourself. He finally turned to her, his eyes steely. I'm doing what I have to do to protect them. To protect Earth. And nothing else matters. The hum of the artifact intensified, matching the quickening rhythm of Evan's heartbeat. It was as if the relic was alive, breathing with him, feeding off his determination. He clenched his fists tighter around it. A surge of energy coursed through him, every nerve alive with the force now running through his veins. The world seemed sharper, clearer. His senses heightened beyond human limits. He could hear every breath, every heartbeat of the soldiers advancing toward them. He could smell the metallic scent of their armor, the staleness of their air. The power was intoxicating. Suddenly, a shriek broke the tension in the air, distant but unmistakable. The first wave of assassins had landed. Astra's forces were here. Now. Evan barked, his voice almost unrecognizable, deepened by the power surging through him. Lyra stepped back, eyes wide, as she looked at him. Evan. You're changing. But he didn't hear her. His focus was elsewhere. His legs moved on their own accord, the ground beneath him almost feeling like an afterthought. His eyes were fixed on the approaching enemies. Each footstep echoed in his mind, and with it, a plan started to form. His tactical mind, now sharpened by the power of the artifact, began calculating with terrifying precision. He wasn't just going to fight them, he was going to hunt them. The first wave of assassins emerged from the shadows, sleek and deadly in their advanced armor. They were fast, efficient, but they were not invincible. Evan's body moved instinctively, his muscles reacting with almost supernatural speed. He darted forward, faster than he had ever moved before, and the first assassin fell before it even knew what had hit it. A flash of steel, a blur of motion, and then nothing but silence. Lyra's voice echoed in his earpiece, a mixture of awe and horror. What the hell are you doing? You're... But Evan couldn't hear her. His focus was elsewhere, on the next target. Another assassin, closing in fast, its weapon raised. He was already moving before it fired, his body instinctively weaving out of the way. He felt the air shift as the bullet passed him by, barely a whisper of sound. Then his hand was around the assassin's throat, and a quick twist, a sudden snap, and the enemy crumpled. He was no longer human. Not in the way he once had been. But with every strike, with every enemy that fell, a part of Evan's humanity began to fade. He could feel it. The hunger for more power, the desire to destroy, to hunt, his mind burned with it. It was seductive. Addictive. He could sense the fear of the assassins now, the shock as they realized they were no longer in control. The predator had become the prey. Behind him, Lyra shouted his name. Evan. Snap out of it. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when they were so close to victory. Not when they were so close to finally making the assassins feel the terror they had inflicted on Earth. Another wave of assassins descended upon him, more vicious than the first. But Evan was ready. His instincts had sharpened beyond his control, his movements precise, ruthless. He tore through them, his body in unstoppable force, a blur of violence. In the distance, Astra watched from above, her expression unreadable. The battle was not over, but Evan's transformation had already begun to tilt the scale. The assassins were beginning to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, they had underestimated the humans. And for the first time in years, Earth's survivors might just have the chance to take back what was theirs. The battle had become a blur of motion. Evan's body moved faster than his mind could comprehend, each action executed with brutal precision. The assassins were no longer the apex predators of this war, they had underestimated humanity, and more importantly, they had underestimated him. The artifact hummed softly in his hands, its power pulsing like a second heartbeat within him. His muscles were strong, every nerve alive with an unnatural energy. But with each enemy he fell, something inside him twisted. The hunger. The drive to become more, to dominate. He could feel the coldness in his bones, the part of him that was no longer truly human. In the distance, Lyra's voice crackled through his earpiece. Evan, you need to stop. You're losing yourself. Evan didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the next target, a small group of assassins making their way toward the survivor's position. They were armed and coordinated, but they were no match for him. He could already see their fear as they realized how much their advantage had evaporated. Get out of the way, he muttered to himself, pushing forward. As he sprinted toward them, his mind was filled with flashes of images, the world he had known, the family he had lost, the friends who had died in the early days of the war. Each death fueled him, stoking the fire inside that made him feel invincible. The first assassin fell in a cloud of dust, its weapon slipping from its hand before it even realized what had happened. The others were slower to react, but it didn't matter. Evan was already on them, moving like a ghost, his attacks swift and decisive. They didn't stand a chance. The air crackled with the sound of combat, the hiss of blasters, the clang of metal against metal. Evan could hear the gasps of the survivors in the distance, their eyes wide with awe and terror as they watched him tear through their enemies. But Lyra's voice pierced through the chaos again, softer now, tinged with desperation. Evan, please. You don't have to do this. You're not one of them. His chest tightened. She was right. In the back of his mind, he knew it. This wasn't him. This couldn't be him. He had come to fight for humanity, to protect it, but now he was something else. Something far darker. And then, through the haze of his own bloodlust, he saw her. Astra, standing at the edge of the battlefield, her posture proud, her dark eyes calculating. She was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. And she was smiling. Evan's breath caught in his throat as their eyes locked. He saw the recognition in her gaze, a recognition of a kindred spirit, a predator who had finally become the hunted. Evan Price, Astra's voice echoed across the field, amplified through her comm system. I see you've embraced the power of the artifact. It's the only way to survive, isn't it? Evan's muscles tightened, his pulse pounding in his ears. She was taunting him, but there was something else in her words. A challenge. A challenge he couldn't resist. You don't know what you're dealing with, he growled, his voice gravelly with the unnatural strength he now possessed. Astra's smile widened. Oh, I know exactly what I'm dealing with. You're not the first to wield the power of the artifact. But I'll be the one to end this. You'll fall, just like the others. Her words struck a chord deep within him. Just like the others. With a primal roar, Evan surged forward, moving faster than the human eye could track. The two of them collided with the force of a storm, their blades clashing, sparks flying in all directions. Astra was fast, calculated, her every move designed for lethal precision. But Evan was driven by something else now. He wasn't just fighting to survive, he was fighting to prove that he was more than what she had made him. Their fight was a blur of motion, the two of them locked in a deadly dance, neither giving an inch. Evan's strength was unmatched, but Astra's skill was superior. She had years of experience, but Evan had the artifact, and with it, the power to shatter anything in his path. Why do you fight? Astra demanded between strikes. You think humanity deserves to survive? Look around you. Your species is broken. I fight because we're not finished, Evan spat back, his voice strained. Because we're better than you think. Astra's eyes flashed with contempt. Then prove it. She lunged, her blade a blur of motion, but Evan was ready. He twisted, his body moving in ways that felt unnatural, and with one swift, powerful strike, he knocked her weapon from her hand. Astra stumbled back, her eyes narrowing. Impressive, she said, though her voice was laced with disdain. But it's too late for you. You've already lost. Evan's heart raced. He could feel the power surging through him, threatening to overtake everything he was. It was tempting. It was easy to give in, to let the artifact control him completely. But as he looked into Astra's eyes, he realized something. She wasn't the true enemy. He was. And with that realization, he made his choice. Evan drove forward, not with brute force, but with a single, decisive strike. Astra's expression faltered for a moment before she fell, the battle finally tipping in humanity's favor.